Magnus Infernum.
Greetings, this is Magnus Infernum, and I am excited, because this week's deck tech is a tribal deck, and I do love me some tribal synergies. So now I will plant the seeds of this Druid Tribal deck. The goal of the deck is to play creatures that help the deck ramp, then utilize the numerable lands to the player's advantage. And the first card of this tree-hugging tribe is a playset of the deck's only mana dork, Elvish Mystic, a 1/1 Elf Druid creature for 1 green mana with the active ability, tap. Add 1 green mana to your mana pool. With this, the player can cast the rest of the creatures in the deck a turn early, allowing the deck to set up more efficiently. You could mix and match Elvish Mystic with Nanowar Elves, but I prefer not having too many low-cost mana producers in the deck, since later in the game they are less helpful. Ramping with just mana isn't vital to the deck strategy, it just helps the deck get to its end goal. Getting lands is far more helpful to the deck. So let's get into the bones of the deck. The first card to assist with this is Civic Wayfinder. For 2 generic and 1 green, you get a 2/2 Elf Warrior Druid creature. When Civic Wayfinder enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card, reveal it, and put it into your hand. If you do, shuffle your library. The second creature is Farhaven Elf, a 1/1 Elf Druid creature for 1 generic and 1 green. When Farhaven Elf enters the battlefield, you may search your library for a basic land card and put it into the battlefield tapped. If you do, shuffle your library. And lastly, Yavimaya Elder, for 1 generic and 2 green, a 2/1 human druid. When Yavimaya Elder is put into the graveyard from the battlefield, you may search your library for up to 2 basic land cards, reveal them, and put them into your hand. If you do, shuffle your library. Tap 2 generic mana, sacrifice Yavimaya Elder, draw a card. For these 3 creatures, play 4 of each. As far as which one should be played first, that depends on what is in your hand as well as the game's current board state. With Yavimaya Elder's land fetching ability activating when it hits the graveyard from the battlefield, it makes a great blocker, especially if in the early game the opponent already has attackers. Or as an added bonus, Yavimaya can chump block or attack to try and make an awkward block for your opponent. And if you have mana open, the Elder could instant speed sacrifice itself to draw a card and let you get the 2 lands in your hand. With Farhaven Elf, this creature is the weakest of the 3, but it gets the caster ahead in land drops. With Civic Wayfinder, it is the strongest of the 3, just as a 2/2, but it does put an extra land into your hand so you don't miss a land drop. Before I talk about the meat of the deck, it does have a little fat, with that being 4 Paragon of Eternal Wilds. For 3 generic and 1 green mana, this human druid is a 2/2 that states, other green creatures you control get +1/+1. Tap 1 green mana and tap Paragon of Eternal Wilds. Another target green creature you control gains trample until end of turn. Druids aren't really known for their fighting prowess, so giving them a little boost can go a long way. Alright, let's get into the meat of the deck and see what it is trying to do. So let's talk about Baru, Fist of Krosa, a 4/4 legendary creature, human druid for 3 generic and 2 green mana. Whenever a force enters the battlefield, green creatures you control get +1/+1 and gain trample until end of turn. Grandeur. Discard another card named Baru, Fist of Krosa. Create an XX green worm creature token, where X is the number of lands you control. Because of the Grandeur ability, 4 of these legendary creatures are played in the deck with no fear of any sitting in the player's hand because there is already one in the battlefield. With Baru's first ability, it is important to mention that it is triggered when a force enters the battlefield and not just when the controller plays a forest. As far as the second ability, the worm token's power and toughness are equal to the number of lands you control when it's created. If more lands are played, the worm's power and toughness does not increase with the number of lands. So this is the first druid that synergizes with lands. The second is Kamahl, Fist of Krosa, a 4/3 legendary creature, human druid for 4 generic and 2 green mana. Tap 1 green mana. Target land becomes a 1/1 creature until end of turn. It's still a land. Tap 2 generic and 3 green mana. Creatures you control get +3/+3 and gain trample until end of turn. So Kamahl ends up being a repeatable overrun on a stick. For just 1 mana, can turn any land, not just the controller's land, into a creature. The deck doesn't run any cards that would be able to destroy the opponent's lands if you were to turn them into a creature. But if a sweeper was played, and if you had open mana, you could try turning some of their lands into creatures so that it would be caught in the crossfire. Now while mana isn't too much of an issue for the deck as it is for some others, Kamahl still costs 6 mana and is a legendary creature, so you can't have more than 1 out in the battlefield at a time. So I normally only have 2 of these creatures in the deck. Now there is another card in the deck that turns lands into creatures, that being Life and Death. More specifically Life, which is a 1 green mana sorcery. All lands you control become 1/1 creatures until end of turn. They're still land. So for the same cost of Kamahl's abilities, all your lands become creatures as opposed to just the one. If your opponent has no cards in hand or is tapped out mana, go ahead and swing out with a sizable Alpha Strike. Death is a sorcery for 1 generic and 1 black. Return target creature card from your graveyard to the battlefield. You lose life equal to the converted mana cost. You could run druids in the deck that have the capability of producing black mana so you can utilize death, but there is another circumstance where this card can be played that I will get more into later. Since I'm mentioning a recursion spell, this is a casual deck that runs green with lots of creatures. Thus, Creeping Renaissance. This is the second deck tech that I've done, and it's also the second inclusion of this card. Well, Creeping Renaissance is a sorcery for 3 generic and 2 green. Choose a permanent type. Return all cards of the chosen type from your graveyard to your hand, and as an added bonus it has flashback for 5 generic and 2 green, allowing it to be cast from your graveyard. If many of the druids have found their way into the graveyard, you can get your creatures back into your hand and reap the rewards of some of the enter the battlefield effects all over again. A ridiculously good card in this deck is Sylvan Advocate, a 2/3 elf druid ally with vigilance for only 1 generic and 1 green mana. As long as you control 6 more lands, Sylvan Advocate and land creatures you control get +2/+2. Thus, having plenty of lands in the battlefield will make Sylvan Advocate a 4/5 vigilance creature, and it will strengthen the power and toughness of your lands you control that you have made into creatures. In this deck, Sylvan Advocate ends up simultaneously being a straightforward creature card that also has depth, and all that just for 2 mana. Now, if you're tired of having friends, then you'll be happy that Gilt-Leaf Archdruid is in this deck. It's an actual druid lord of sorts. This elf druid creature is a 3/3 for 3 generic and 2 green mana. Whenever you cast a druid spell, you may draw a card. Tap 7 untapped druids you control, gain control of all lands target player controls. Well, there's a couple of things I want to mention with this card. And when I say a couple, I mean quite a bit. For its first ability, it activates with druid spells. As of right now, there is no non-creature druid spells. There are, however, cards with the ability of Changeling that makes them every creature type at all times. This can activate the draw ability, and it is important to mention that this is a May ability. Since the deck does search for lands in addition to the Archdruid's draw ability, there is always the potential for decking yourself. Since each of these creatures' abilities are May abilities, there is little fear to losing the game due to the lack of a deck. Now for the Archdruid's second ability. Even if any of the druids just entered the battlefield, such as Gilt-Leaf Archdruid itself, the druids still can be tapped even though they have summoning sickness. And just like the Archdruid's first ability, the druid's tap doesn't necessarily have to be creatures, but they could be druid artifacts or druid enchantments, which there are none. This is just something that's nice to note for the future. And going back to Life and Death, if you gain control of your opponent's black mana producing lands, then you are capable of casting Death. A few more things to quickly mention. The second ability can be done at instant speed, so you can do it on your opponent's turn. Also, if Gilt-Leaf Archdruid would leave the battlefield while the game is still going, the stolen lands are not returned to the owner. And with Kamahl Fist of Krosa's first ability, you can use your opponent lands that you took as chump blockers. As far as when you should play Gilt-Leaf Archdruid, personally, I like to play the card when I already have 6 druids on the battlefield, so the Archdruid is the 7th druid needed and can immediately take one of the player's lands. But the Archdruid can always be played earlier to take advantage of its draw ability. I only played 3 of this card in the deck. The vast majority of the time, you only need it out on the battlefield one at a time. Having more than one out at a time makes more targets for your opponent's spells. Also, real talk, it makes the deck a little bit cheaper, seeing as how Gilt-Leaf Archdruid is $4 to $5. Speaking of costs, as far as the deck's land base, 24 forest. Since this is a monocolored deck, there is no need for mana fixing. Also, Baru, Fist of Krosa's first ability requires specifically forest for it to trigger. So most non-basic lands would inhibit this ability, with the exception of Sap Seep Forest, a non-basic land that is also a forest. Tap to add 1 green mana to your mana pool. Sap Seep Forest enters the battlefield tap. Tap 1 green mana and tap Sap Seep Forest. You gain 1 life. Play this ability only if you control 2 or more green permanents. The fact that this card enters the battlefield tap really holds it back. And since the life-gaining ability requires the land itself to be tapped, you're effectively using 2 mana to gain life. And that is only if you have 2 or more green permanents in the battlefield. So for me, I just like to play the 24 forest. The deck as is has no other way to gain life, so it could potentially help in the long run. Here are the alterations for the deck. One major problem with the deck is it has no flyers, so adding a little anti-flying spot removal could help. While you could run Plummet, I prefer Crushing Canopy, since it can also destroy an enchantment, with which the deck also is lacking in. And if you don't mind the mana cost, you can try playing Return to the Earth, so the deck has the option to destroy a target artifact, enchantment, or creature with flying. And if you prefer the mana-producing creatures over the land-fetching kind, like I said earlier, you could throw in some Llanowar Elves into the deck. And Druid of the Cowl is a 2-cost option that has 3 toughness. And if you want a stronger version of life, there is Natural Affinity, making the lands into 2/2 creatures as opposed to life's 1/1 creatures. Natural Affinity is also an instant. If need be, you can use the lands as blockers. Natural Infinity's costs take out 2 more lands as attackers than life would. Because of this, I choose life. But if you end up adding in the mana dorks, the Natural Affinity could be a viable option, since you could use the creatures to pay for the cost as opposed to the lands. Now I want to talk about Paragon of Eternal Wilds versus Gaia's Anthem. Paragon of Eternal Wilds has the advantage of being a druid, assisting Gilt-Leaf Archdruid's abilities. It also can give your green creatures trample, which would be helpful for the worm token that Baru creates. On the other side, Gaia's Anthem costs 1 less and will also increase the power and toughness of your lands if and when you turn them into creatures, in contrast to Paragon of Eternal Wilds only pumping up your green creatures. Of course, one is a creature and the other is an enchantment, so depending on what colors your opponents are playing, they might be able to deal with one more than the other. I wanted to mention the Anthem cards because you could actually make a pump-up variant of this deck. Throw out those usual mana-producing druids and land-fetching druids. Instead, run Ixalig's Diviner and Elvish Harbinger. The Harbinger helps produce mana and can look for Gilt-Leaf Archdruid, and the variant included Riskar Pima Renegade. The Ixalig's Diviner help get lands into the hand. Or it fixes your top deck as well as getting a +1/+1 counter which synergizes with Riskar's mana ability. And with this build, you might as well put in a playset of Paragon of Eternal Wilds and Gaia's Anthem. Since this variant of the deck isn't as hard pressed as getting as much lands out, this gives the opportunity to play Llanowar Reborn and Oron Reef of the Vastwood, getting even more counters on your creatures. Also, it is a little bit more on the expensive side, at around $8, but Metallic Mimic would also work well in this kind of build. Oh, and I don't want to forget about the combo players, who would love to play Paleoloth, a 5/5 green beast creature for 4 generic and 2 green mana. Whenever another creature with power 5 or greater enters the battlefield under your control, you may return target creature card from your graveyard to your hand. Now, if you have 5 or more lands, borrow Fist of Krosa and Paleoloth on the battlefield, as well as borrow Fist of Krosa in your hand. You could use Borrow's Grandeur ability to discard the Borrow that is in your hand, putting it into the graveyard. You'll then get a worm token with power 5 or greater into the battlefield. Because of this, Paleoloth's ability activates, allowing you to return the Borrow that you discarded back into your hand, so then you can start this whole process over again, netting you as many worm tokens as your heart desires. And just to mention a planeswalker that would fit well for the deck, Freyalise Llanowar Fury. For 5 mana, her +2 gets you a 1/1 green elf druid that taps for green mana, the -2 destroys target artifact or enchantment, and the -6 draws a card for each green creature you control. Being able to create the druid tokens are able to benefit the Archdruid's land-taking ability, being a 1/1 body that is able to produce mana, helping activate or taking advantage of Kamahl's overrun ability, and being able to get pumped up by the Paragon's Anthem ability. The +2 loyalty can be very beneficial for the deck. All in all, this is a pretty fun deck. The 3-drop druids help take lands out of the deck, increasing the probability of getting a druid, with which the deck is running 33 of. With this many creatures, in conjunction with being able to turn your lands into creatures themselves to help take out the opponent. Even without the help of the lands, there is enough creatures in the deck to give your opponents trouble. And oh boy are they in big trouble if you actually get the opportunity to take their lands from them. But the deck does have a glaring problem, being that it is so focused on what the deck is trying to do that it neglects what the other players are doing. So if the opponent is giving the deck too much trouble, it doesn't really have an answer. And something that may or may not be a problem is the deck's price. It runs at about $40 to $45. With the 3 Gilt-Leaf Druids costing between $11 to $13 total, the 2 Kamahls costing $5 to $6 each, with Baru, Fist of Krosa, Sylvan Advocate, Farhaven Elf, and Yavimaya Elder costing around 75 cents to $1.50 each. Oh, that is it. What do you think about the deck? Is tribal strategies your idea of fun? I know it is for me. And what kind of changes would you make to the deck? Leave a comment and let me know. Thank you very much for watching. If you enjoyed the content, then press the like button. If you found the video displeasing, then press the dislike button. Bolt that subscribe button to stay up to date with future videos. This is Magnus Infernum. Till we meet again.